All right, everyone. Welcome again to Performance Psych Musings. My name is Peter Piasecki.
And I'm David Farouk.
Yeah, and we want to welcome you again to this conversation that we're having about emerging topics, about our journey in the performance psychology discipline. And we'll get right into it. So Dave, offline, we were just briefly talking what we wanted to bring up today, and I would love for you to introduce this idea.
Awesome. Okay, thanks, Pete. Glad to have you all back. Well, what we're speaking about, being, in education, constantly learning new concepts, learning new frameworks. I've been teaching a module where I'm teaching motivational interviewing. So really a lot of broad general frameworks, a lot of useful frameworks that you do see people implement, right? And there's a lot of research even around implementation of different frameworks, sometimes, as interventions or different ways that they're utilized, right? But I was thinking kind of more broadly, just when you are learning, a lot of different frameworks, sometimes people call it, the alphabet soup or whatever, right? There's all the different sort of acronyms and stuff. And I was just thinking about sort of on a kind of a meta level, kind of the concept of concepts as it relates to performance, right? So you could look at it either way, both from the side of, say, a performance psychologist or practitioner, how do the concepts and frameworks that they learn, how does that change their actual abilities in the world? And similarly, the concepts or skills, techniques that they teach to a client, how does that exactly impact, influence, or affect the client in their domain that they utilize those as well? So it's kind of a broad question, but I thought we could just kind of riff on that a little bit. I think it is a really deep question that has probably been answered in different ways by different people at different times, right? So I think it's probably not something we'll get to the bottom of, but it might be useful kind of to explore. So
yeah, no, totally. It's almost like stepping off of the edge into the abyss, thinking about this question. But I think it's especially relevant when it comes to, I mean, as you mentioned, the educational side of then the process of being in this field. And like you said, we're learning concepts, frameworks, and then we're applying them. But are we actually thinking about and maybe discerning how this is actually impacting the individual we're working with, right? And what's being translated, right? And where my mind always goes, and I think due to the training, is like the process of behavioral change. Like we hope we are impacting that, right? And even that's a framework in itself, right? Obviously. But initially that's where my mind goes, thinking about that. But also I think even the definitions of words that we use in a consulting space is very much so each person we work with has the definition already, right? Does it correspond with the, correct definition, whatever that means, through an academic lens or sort of empirical lens? Oftentimes it doesn't, right? And I think a classic example of that is like the buzzwords that get thrown around, right?
right.
I don't know. And that's like where my mind goes. It's like, is it helpful to have those just hard, and obviously from an empirical standpoint, like when you're exploring concepts, it's important. I get that. But from a in a case-by-case basis, I'm wondering, like, is it helpful or is it limiting?
And I think what comes to me with a lot of these different terms is what people take as explanatory or what feels useful to people in terms of understanding something, which obviously is another Pandora's box that could be open. But I think for me, I notice sometimes it's a lot of kind of implicit appeal to authority, right? So if people have a sense, oh, that this framework is evidence based, or some term that it's has a certain authoritative status, it feels more explanatory to people. And I think an example that I would maybe throw out is the way that neurotransmitters are commonly spoken about, right? So if you could say, take the word dopamine, right? And you could give the exact same conceptual explanation to somebody without using the word dopamine, right? And just say, well, when you feel like this, and then this happens, right? But by sort of anthropomorphizing or almost imagining dopamine as like a character, sort of personifying it, for whatever reason, that sticks with people, right? And I guess that's part of what I was thinking about, is like, I think that probably says a lot about, maybe the status of, neuroscience in popular culture as being very authoritative to people, right? Why is it that we could say, oh, this is what happens, right? We could give some certain type of sequences or processes. Some people might use the term mechanisms, right? But if you couch it maybe in terms of neurotransmitters, people might say, oh, this is like the ultimate explanation of this, when you haven't added any additional information, right? And it maybe is not always neuroscience based, right? But it could be even another framework that people say, oh, this framework is the real scientific one. So what do you think about the role of authority and in kind of the way people respond to terms?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there, and as you mentioned, like the mechanism of it, and when it comes to exploring it, and I'm thinking first, like looking at it from a framework like scientist practitioner, right? Looking at it from a scientist perspective, it's like, okay, we're pursuing to further understand certain concepts and frameworks, right? So there has to be essentially a baseline understanding. Okay, this is what we define X as, right? And then we build off of it. Of course, then you fall into the trap potentially, where people just start making up terms that explain a concept that has already been sort of articulated, right? And whether that's for publication reasons or what have you, but we won't jump into that. I think when it comes to the perspective of the practical level, and authority, like you were asking, it is interesting to see certain individuals, and I mean just practitioners in general, using certain language to come off as almost authoritative, and almost like there's a sense of power in like, well, neuroscience says, which is very interesting because there's still such a limitation to how we understand the brain, and I mean, even changing language with saying like neuroscience knows this at the moment because there's still so much to understand, right? But I also get how you want to develop a sense of whether it's buy-in, right? And giving people, I usually approach people and give people benefit of the doubt, for better or worse. And that's just been my sort of framework I live around, just like move through life with, right? So I believe people are doing it from the sense of a sense of goodness and sense of like goodwill and wanting the best for their clients, right? But then I can imagine people also use that authority to either provide individuals with a sense of, okay, this person knows more than I do, so I just need to believe this is truth, this is fact, like, and that sense of like, almost like, I don't know if this is the right term, coercive buy-in, like you're just using terms just to use the terms, instead of coming down to the level of the person you're talking to. And it's like, if an academic is speaking about a certain concept and you're speaking to, I don't know, an 8th grader, right? Hopefully you're able to bring some of that jargon down and make that 8th grader understand better. And I hope that practitioners are doing the same with their clients who aren't in academic settings and are strictly, I mean, performers, and they just want to benefit from the services that they're being provided, if that makes sense.
So I guess what is interesting to me is you can almost maybe liken it to a placebo effect, though, where I think sometimes if something carries a certain weight, it ends up actually having more of an effect on people just because they believe that it's authoritative. And that's sort of an interesting point, I suppose, if, you know, thinking in terms of performance psychology, it sort of a little bit blurs, I suppose, what's useful and what's true, I guess.
Yeah.
But
No.
I think there's also, because I suppose where I'm coming at it from is sometimes I'll hear people use different terminology, right? But they seem to me like they got a lot of mileage out of it. And maybe I don't know if I'm just
Mileage, sorry to interrupt. Mileage in this sense is such a great term.
yeah,
Yeah, but go on.
or kilometerage in Europe.
Yeah, that's true.
But yeah, but I think what I sometimes feel is that part of what people are getting out of it is a certain prestige of just knowing that term. Because if you would have the same, in terms of what does this term or concept that they're utilizing actually mean for what they're doing, if you would put it in more simple kind of layman's terms, it might not change. But I think somehow it takes it off that pedestal for people sometimes.
Mm.
You know, if they think, oh, this is a real technique, as opposed to, you know, something that's just not packaged as nicely, you know, and as authoritatively, but something's just explained as a kind of a, okay, well, you know, if you do this, you know, then this and this, then. So I think that's a kind of a interesting thing to think about, both culturally, what makes things carry that certain prestige. Because sometimes I'll hear people use terms, right, that in my mind, theoretically, I might think that it's not particularly valid, right? And again, like, you know, people are open to disagree, but then sometimes I'll just see, well, this seems really meaningful to somebody. So what does that mean? You know, and even you get a lot of things, right, where things are debunked or whatever, like learning styles or like all these certain mythologies, right? And you see people utilize them, right? And I'm not trying to go into anything says goes, right? Like, I'm not saying that this is necessarily right, but I think it is interesting to kind of discuss what makes people kind of feel like terms are useful, concepts, frameworks are useful to them. If it's something more than just this kind of appeal to authority of, oh, look at me, I know neurotransmitters, look at me, I know cognitive biases, I know some, you know, mechanisms that this person, you know, posits for this process, right? Because I think that is, I mean, it's kind of easy maybe to criticize, but I think sometimes there is sort of that pop science level where people feel, you know, oh, you know, they read a few Malcolm Gladwell books or whatever, and then they
I mean, yeah, the charlatans, if you will.
yeah. But yeah, how would you understand maybe how would you understand something above and beyond just sort of a placebo and appeal to authority and, oh, I feel good because I know this, you know, this framework that has a certain prestige associated with it. How would you think about, like, let's say a framework or a technique that you're teaching to a client having an impact on sort of their self-efficacy, to use another concept?
Um, with you bringing in sort of the cultural sort of context that we're in, or maybe not necessarily bringing in the culture context, but thinking about culture in the depth of this conversation, there's so much to unpack there. And my mind goes to the prestige, or I don't even know if it, in my mind, I think just the weight of a term, you know, based off of the cultural context. And I mean, I don't know the data, but I'm pretty sure when thinking about terms, particularly in performance psychology, they're oftentimes used in wellness and well-being, like in those sort of spaces. And as we know, the wellness industry is, I don't know, probably like already multi-billion-dollar industry, you know, with individuals who are throwing around certain terms because they have this sort of weight or prestige around it, right? And I think, of course, for better or worse, right? And this is where my mind sort of dives into when it comes to this sort of idea of whether, yes, someone read a few Malcolm Gladwell books, or someone read X amount of like self-help books, and now is this term so popular, I'm just going to jump on it and create a master class and sell it for $5,000, right? Because of that sort of concept. And then, so this is what I struggle with. I do see, like, in performance psychology, and I know across the world this looks different. I'm talking about from a United States perspective, right? It even looks a little different in Canada too, so I can't necessarily say North America. But looking at a performance consultant, right? Or a performance psychologist, like you're a licensed psychologist and you focus in performance, right? Versus a life coach who, I mean, there's no licensing body really. I mean, maybe there's some popping up, but I don't think there's a licensing body. There are definitely certification bodies, right? Different organizations or institutions you could get certified. Certifications don't hold that much weight, right? There isn't necessarily there aren't like ethical obligations where if depending, but it's not like you're threatening your license if X happens, right? Versus a certification might look a little different. So in performance psychology, a lot of the same terms are used with like life coaches, or even mind coaches, mental coaches, what have you, right? And this conversation comes up in the setting of a graduate program where students are moving towards wanting to get licensed or even certified in mental performance. And individuals are getting angry at the ones who just read a few books and are sort of monetizing what they've read and what they're teaching. But then at the same time, who's to say that those individuals who didn't go the graduate school route are not doing good work, right? And are not helpful. And this is where I think what you're saying is the placebo comes into play, right? Is where someone maybe understands some of these frameworks and has learned to apply it, maybe anecdotally, right? Maybe no research involved. And they're extremely skilled at using language and are off the charts with soft skills, right? And are able to sell it in a way that there's authority in it for the individual who is seeking support, right? Because first off, oftentimes it's someone who is looking for something more, right? Who is pursuing these services, and they need to believe in it. So it's almost like just inherently from that interaction of, I need help with my performance. You know this because you speak about it. I believe you're going to help me. And that's where those soft skills come into play, in my opinion, that whether it's due to rapport, whether it's due to, in addition to like a placebo of just believing this will help me. And maybe, and then looking at that situation versus someone who's in grad school, right? who may have all the knowledge, has done research, has done is reading empirical work like every day, but maybe does not have the soft skills and is frustrated that they're not having clients. This is like this, there's like this push and pull of the charlatans, right?
Mm.
And then the trained, right?
Mhm.
And which one has the authority? And I don't know if I'm necessarily answering your question, but that's where my mind goes.
Yeah,
And I think both can do great work.
right.
Both can be supplemental. Also recognizing that performance psychology is a luxury service, right? Like if, I mean, yeah, I actually will not go down that route, but it is a luxury service, right?
Mhm.
So it's not like inherently like people need this, people need performance psych. Like I recognize that too. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I guess what comes to me is when you mentioned the term soft skills, right? Is I think we have this tendency to like make a really sharp dichotomy between sort of knowledge in a verbal sense, right? You know, I could tell you about Bender's self-efficacy, and you know different concepts associated with that and processes, right? Versus when we say soft skills or nonverbal skills, it's interesting to think about the relationship between those two, right? Particularly now, you know, I'm lecturing, I think you're teaching a little bit, right?
Last
In
semester.
some sense, right? The relevant skill is actually knowing those concepts, right? So it kind of a little bit goes both ways there. But it's interesting to me, like most, I think whether it's performance psych or clinical psych, any kind, usually if something's clinical, there's almost always some requirement for clinical hours, right, to get certification.
Absolutely.
Right? And I think that's sort of what that's aiming at is that idea that there's so much context going on. I think that's what's hard to really control for, is you know, like say I've read a lot, you know, history of psychology, and I could probably on that verbal knowledge level probably, you know, go through history of 20th century psychology on par with a lot of people who are clinical psychologists. But in no way, shape, or form do I think I'm anywhere near qualified to be in the chair, you know, like not even close, right? So then you think, okay, well, what's the other part? I think we're selling it short a little bit if we just say that it's, oh, it's nonverbal or something. Because I don't know about you, but the thing that comes to my mind when I hear like soft skills, nonverbal, is like just a little body language, some kind of you know, like it sounds like it sounds like one of those things where it's like, oh, if you just have good posture, like, or you know,
Yeah.
like, right? But I think for me, that is where a lot of the layers of context come in. I'll tell you what I mean. So if you are, you know, a performance psychologist, Peter Pasecki, you know, letters by the name.
That's all that matters, right?
Yeah, letters by the name, right? And I come to your office, don't know anything about you. Aside from that, you have these letters by your name, you're a performance psychologist, right? From your perspective, in some sense, you know, you meet me on a blank, you know, sort of that's sort of your starting point, T0 for you, right?
Totally.
But for me, as the client, I've already like engaged with the whole system, right? And maybe I have, you know, gotten recommendation from a friend. Maybe you even have some reviews online or whatever. You know, it's always a little hard to tell from those things, but it's already the whole context. Like so much of this interaction is already set for me because I'm thinking I'm going to a performance psychologist or, you know, whatever type of practitioner it is, you know, but that already carries so much layers of context, right? And I realized this actually when I was working in neurofeedback. Wearing scrubs is a trip. Like just putting on scrubs, you feel people seeing you as something entirely different, right? So it's very difficult to say that the moment that you meet that person is sort of the beginning of the interaction, right?
Mm,
Because you have been co-opted into this whole system, this whole framework with which people have already made a choice to engage. That framework already has certain position in their life, right? They're seeking interaction with it for certain reasons. That means certain things to them, right? They've had previous experiences that obviously you have nothing to do with, but they will on some level associate with you, right? And it's difficult to say exactly what those associations will be, right? With what other type of practitioners, with, you know, whether it's negative, positive, right? So I think it's sort of having the gravity to sit in that position and know I'm just meeting this person, but I'm occupying some other kind of role that I don't exactly know. And I think that is a lot of what people learn in like clinical hours. What do you think about that?
that, to be honest, I have, it's crossed my mind, but I have never been sort of confronted with that idea where, and that maybe I have. And obviously you think about the bias a client comes in, right, with, and that's where I think that's where the conversation starts, is like, what is the bias the client's coming in with? But it
Mm-hmm.
stops there. And I think what you're saying goes beyond that, right? Which is fascinating. So there definitely are like expectations, preconceived notions, whether conscious or subconscious, for an individual coming into the room.
Mm-hmm.
And that does impact what's going to occur in the next X amount of sessions.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe what you're speaking about and having that awareness, and of course, I'm not licensed psychologist yet.
Mm-hmm.
I'm still collecting hours. I have more hours in the performance setting than clinical settings. But I think what you're speaking about is the difference between competency and
Mm-hmm.
expertise,
Mm-hmm.
you know, where I think, in my opinion, an expert totally understands that someone's coming in. They already have some sort of ideas coming into this space. And maybe part of the experience is developing a sense of self-awareness, bringing it to light, and whether demystifying, right, what have you. And that would be sort of the process of whatever that might look like. But I also believe, I've never been in a situation with the scrubs, what you were saying, like how just because you're wearing scrubs, people are willing to like share so much.
Mm-hmm.
Like I remember you sharing this in the
Yeah.
past, like people sort of like uh word vomit their what they're dealing with, what they're struggling with, what their concerns are, just because you have scrubs on, because of their ideas of, okay, this person's a, whether a medical doctor or he's doing neurofeedback, so he must be maybe a psychiatrist, like, right. Or they have that sort of bias going into it and just thinking about scrubs, right? So it would be interesting to see how a individual who is coming in, and I always, not always, oftentimes I ask, okay, so especially when it's when it's an individual who has never done therapy, like looking at it from the clinical stance, I always usually like go down the road of exploring, like, hey, so do you have any expectations or questions? Like, what are your ideas of what's going to happen in between in this relationship, right? And not exactly that, like that's a loaded question, obviously, but sort of do that exploration. But I also think, going back to your question about the self-efficacy of the individual you're working with, I think it depends where they lie on the sort of self-esteem spectrum with willing to share, right? Because oftentimes some people are like, they meet you and they're like, I don't want to tell you what I was thinking coming in here, right?
Mhm.
And that's going to be revealed like throughout that relationship and that process, right? Yeah, so I do think, and like I said, I haven't been, I mean, I'm doing a PhD in counseling psychology, and those questions have not been raised really that often, if at all. Which now I'm thinking about it, I'm like, that's a little concerning. Like, is that something we're just supposed to learn through the process, or is that just like, yeah, inherently a self sort of guided journey?
Right.
You know.
Well, and I think you could maybe, another thing that came to my mind is similar, was like, I remember the first time when I went up in front of the class to lecture, right? And we were in undergrad together, but it's was again just trippy to me because I was like remembering being on the other side and looking up, at whoever was there, and just thinking like, the first time, and I think this is true probably most of the times you step into a role for the first time or two, right? Is you have a sense, I wouldn't say of inadequacy, but that that you like are not accustomed to feeling in that role, right? Like now at this point, like I go in, like, and just like you don't think about it, it becomes so routine, right? But
Mhm.
what I feel like happens is, and you notice this a lot with kids, right? When you work with kids too, it's like if something's routine to you, it puts them at ease. They know that you are like really comfortable in that role, right? Um, but it's weird because I feel like that's a hard thing to fake, and it's more subtle, I think, with adults, right? Kids sometimes respond to it, like say, the classic, like, oh, substitute teacher comes in, right? And they're like, oh, act up, right? But adults is more subtle, but I think also people do, I wouldn't say that it's just like a confidence. People sense, I think, quite deeply how you fit into the role that you occupy.
Yeah.
And what changes between when you're in that role. You might have all of the relevant competencies, but you don't yet feel like you identify deeply with that role because you're still kind of trying it on, versus after, like, say now when I go up to the front to teach, like it's not that thought anymore of like, oh, I'm up here. It's just, again, part of my day.
Totally.
So like that changes, but it's a subtle thing. Like that's what I mean. It's more than just like a non-verbal. It's not like I just like do a different, body language or something. Like it actually feels different to me. And the fact that it feels different to me conveys something different.
Totally. It's not just a mantra before I step into the room.
Yeah.
I don't know if I should be laughing about it because some people take mantras extremely seriously, whether spiritually or pre-performance routines. But I totally agree. It goes beyond that, and it's almost, I mean, to lack of a better way of putting it, it's almost at the cellular level you embody it. And it's funny you say that. So recently, I've been talking with an individual who like doing some performance consulting and with executives, right? And this individual and I, we were talking about like, what does that look like in the startup space, right? And we had an interesting conversation that there are so many, and what he was mentioning, fakes, right? So many people who talk the talk, but then when they get in front of an executive, I mean, whoever that might be, whatever letters that might look like, right? They have no idea what they're doing, and the executive's confused. Like, we hired you for X. Why? Like, I'm not getting anything out of it, right? And then they let them go, right? And I think that's exactly what you're talking about, particularly in and I guess like high pressure situations, it's that much more important to embody what you're doing, right? Because it's the idea, game recognizes game, you know, and that goes beyond what concepts, what terminology, whatever you're trying to use as a facade to get you into the room or what have you. What matters is how you're holding that presence, you know. And I do believe that that's, and I don't think I have the correct vocabulary to even articulate it. And I haven't really explored the literature about it. Whether it's parapsychology, I don't even know, maybe. Or whether it's just like, yeah, holding space, you know. Because it's definitely, I think it's at the nervous system level. Like thinking back to, hopefully, if once you become an expert at something, particularly in performance psychology or just psychology in general, someone who has a heightened state of arousal, right? And you're the individual sitting in the room that they're seeking to be provided with services. I'm hoping your ability to self-regulate and self-regulate your nervous system and provide a calm space non-verbally for that individual provides them with a sense of ease as well, right? And obviously that looks different for everyone, and depending on, is this person in crisis, is this person not, you know, like I understand that. But I do think it goes beyond, like what you're saying is like, it goes beyond the self-efficacy of the practitioner. It goes beyond sort of the knowledge and the understanding of their education. However, I do think those are building blocks, right? Yeah, what do you think about that? Like the idea of the presence and sort of the relating that to the sense of how that person fills the space,
right,
with their nervous system and things like that.
Yeah, I think what comes to me is, and this is probably the bias maybe of my theoretical leanings, but is how many nested layers of context there are, right? So it is the nervous system, but your nervous system is inside of, you know, say that room, that space that you're in, right? And that space is, it's situated within other nested structures as well, right? So, you know, it may be within a physical building, but also if that room is your office, it's situated within the structure of that clinical practice, right?
Totally.
So what's interesting to me is how your nervous system is responding to all those different levels, and how that changes, I think, over time as well, right? Because like, let's say, you know, you've got your clinical license and your first client come in, right? And maybe you're feeling a bit, you know, a little bit anxious, a little bit of like physical arousal, right? But you have like some self-regulation techniques, and you kind of do a little bit of breathing, whatever type of techniques you're going to do. And maybe that ability to self-regulate is really important, right? But there was still that initial reaction between you, your nervous system, and this situation of context, which is, we don't really know how deeply nested it is. It's just big, right? But you have this response to it, right? And then at some other point in time, eventually, you know, the next year, you got another client comes in, and that initial response is not present the same way, right? And the change between is something to me that implies a change in the way that you sit within all these different nested levels. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. It does make
But
sense.
I think that's a difficult thing to tease out exactly how to best progress in a way. I don't think it's necessarily unhealthy when people are coming into new contexts, you know, to feel the weight of that, right? I think there should be some responsibility, right, associated with it. So, I think feeling that's maybe healthy, right?
And
But
and sorry to interrupt. And going back to what I said, I don't mean like people shouldn't feel a certain level of arousal when they first step into a role, right? That's normal. Like that anxiousness is frankly like it shows that you care about it. But from what I'm hearing you say is that begins to subside with the experience, right?
Right. And I guess what I'm thinking is really fascinating for us as, performance psychology, professionals to think about is what that change is, right? Both in our own journey, but also, for people who we work with, because they will have similar, progressions in different domains as well.
Yeah, it's my mind goes to the idea of I mean the classic idea of visualization and like having a performer put themselves in a situation they haven't been in, but you're asking what's actually happening, and I mean there's definitely a sense of knowing and awareness, right, of I've been here before, right? And I mean just thinking about like the path to automaticity or the path to flow, what have you, like it's not it could be something that you've done so many times, right? Where it becomes just automatic, and you're not cognitively worrying about what's happening in the moment. It's just happening with the progression of the event, right, of that moment. And I think where my mind goes with this is like, and this might be an example, is I remember during my master's having my first client ever in person, right? And I wasn't able to regulate. Like I was like jittering left and right in my chair, but it's not like I mean, I think it went fairly well, I guess, giving myself the benefit of the doubt. But now it's been what, 2 years since that first ever time, and it's totally different. Like, and what you said, there's this progression that occurred, and I don't know if I can put my finger on it, like what actually changed. And obviously you can attribute it to the confidence with repetition and sort of the process toward expertise and being intentional through that process, right, of practicing, but what occurred in me is difficult to sort of explain around like what you're saying being nested in each of those, the context you said, right? Yeah, what occurred in me, like I think each sort of nest, I guess I stepped in with a sense of, with a known sense that there's risk, right? And accepting that risk. And I think at first that occurred because I believe that each person, we all make decisions, and those decisions are, I mean, not acting is a decision, right? Like not even, that's neutrality is taking a stance, right? I guess if you want to say it that way. But a lot of the times people are avoiding those risky situations where they feel uncomfortable, right? I don't think everybody is capable of stepping into uncomfortable situations, and using them from looking at it from a sense of development, And I think that speaks to just like the performance world in general, right? Because if everyone was capable of stepping into uncomfortable situations and they understood that it's for development, then we would have many more individuals who are just extremely high performing, right? But yeah, but what happened to me from that first time ever to now, the way I would explain it is like, and sort of define it, is probably like, yeah, like the process of repetition and sort of feeling comfortable and developing that sense of self-efficacy in my clinical work, and also expanding my understanding of what it means to be in that space, educationally, experientially. Yeah.
Excellent.
That's where my mind goes. But
it's, I mean, education, I feel like, is such a, or learning is such a fascinating thing on so many different levels.
it is. No, yeah, that's why when you started with like the question of like, okay, the question of like the language and the depth, like the meta of the language we're using in performance psychology. I'm not gonna lie, I felt a little fearful. I was like, we don't ask these questions enough in academia. Particularly, I think it's a conversation that should happen at the graduate school level, where we're training the next sort of generation, if you will, of practitioners, you know, because it's a worthy conversation to have and a consistent discussion that should be occurring, right? In my opinion. But yeah. So yeah, I guess that will have it for today. Thanks everyone for tuning in and listening to Performance Psych Musings with Dave and myself, Peter. We're shooting for bi-weekly recordings. If you have any comments or any questions, or even any recommendations for topics to explore, we are open and willing to challenge ourselves in this new venture and space that we discuss some of these topics.
We'd love to hear your thoughts as well. If anyone has any thoughts or comments on sort of this discussion, hopefully it's relevant to people's experiences. So we'd love to hear from you guys as well.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, everyone, take care, and we'll see you tune back in 2 weeks.